there comes a moment in every painful connection with an avoidant where something inside you breaks. Not because you stopped loving them, but because you finally got tired of chasing someone who kept running. You texted first. You over-explained yourself. You tried to prove your worth again and again. And the harder you chased, the colder they became. But here's what most people never understand. Avoidants are not secretly looking for someone to control them. They're not waiting for someone to pressure them harder. And deep down, they are not running because you cared too much. They're running because love activates fear inside them. Fear of losing freedom. Fear of emotional dependence. Fear of disappointing you. Fear of being fully seen. And the moment you stop chasing, something shifts. For the first time, they feel the silence. Not the angry silence. Not manipulation. Not revenge. They feel your emotional absence. And suddenly, the safety net they took for granted is gone. This is where most people make a huge mistake. They think the goal is to make the avoidance suffer. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself. Because the truth is, when you stop chasing, you stop bleeding in. Who's someone who keeps pulling away. And that changes your entire presence. You become calmer, stronger, more grounded. And ironically, that is the version of you an avoidant feels safest with. Now listen carefully. What avoidants secretly want to hear after you stop chasing is not, "Why are you ignoring me? Do you even care? I did everything for you." Those words create pressure. And pressure makes avoidants retreat deeper into themselves. What they secretly want to hear is something emotionally mature, something calm, something that carries strength without force. Something like, "I'm no longer chasing what doesn't choose me, but I still wish you peace." That sentence hits differently. Why? Because it carries no desperation, no emotional begging, no chains. And for an avoidant, emotional freedom feels safer than emotional demand. You must understand this. Avoidants often expect people to react emotionally when they pull away. They expect anger, clinginess, panic. But when you respond with self-respect and calm detachment, you become unforgettable. Because now they're forced to sit with something unfamiliar. The possibility of losing someone who truly understood them. And here's the deeper truth nobody talks about. Avoidants secretly want reassurance without pressure. They want connection without feeling trapped. They want love that says, "You are free, and I am still whole without controlling you." That energy changes everything. Because emotional strength is magnetic. When you stop chasing, you stop communicating fear. And when fear disappears, your value rises. Suddenly the avoidant begins wondering, why are they so calm now? Why do I feel their absence? What if I lost someone real? That's when the emotional walls begin to crack. Not because you manipulated them, but because you finally returned to yourself. And let me tell you something powerful. The greatest transformation in your life begins the moment you stop begging for love and start embodying it within yourself. You stop trying to convince people to stay. You stop shrinking your standards. You stop sacrificing your peace for temporary attention. And the energy you once wasted chasing someone else becomes the energy that rebuilds your confidence. That's power. Real power is not forcing someone to love you. Real power is becoming emotionally strong enough to walk away from what constantly drains your soul. And strangely enough, that is often the moment avoidants finally feel your value. Not when you begged, not when you chased, but when your silence carried dignity, when your presence no longer screamed fear, when your heart stopped saying, "Please choose me," and started saying, "I choose myself too." Because at the end of the day, avoidants secretly want to hear something very few people are strong enough to say. "I care about you deeply, but I will not lose myself trying to keep you." That sentence carries love, but it also carries boundaries. And boundaries are what create respect. So if you've stopped chasing, don't panic. This may be the first time the avoidant truly feels your absence. But more importantly, it may be the first time you finally feel your own strength. And that changes everything. There comes a point in these connections where everything feels confusing, intense, and emotionally exhausting, especially when you're dealing with someone who pulls away just when things start to feel real. What most people don't understand is that this behavior is not random. It's rooted in a deep internal conflict inside avoidant individuals, where closeness who ascent feel like comfort at first, it feels like pressure, expectation, and loss of control. When love is calm and distant, they can manage it. When it's light, casual, and non-demanding, they feel safe enough to stay engaged. But the moment emotional depth enters the picture, something shifts inside them. It's not that they stop caring. In fact, many avoidants care deeply. But caring and feeling safe at the same time becomes a contradiction in their nervous system. The same emotional connection that you experience as bonding, they may experience as pressure building up against their sense of independence. This is why when you start chasing, texting more, explaining yourself, or trying to fix the distance, it doesn't create closeness in their mind. Instead, it reinforces the exact feeling they were trying to escape. Every extra message, every emotional question, every attempt to clear things up can unconsciously register to them as emotional demand. And emotional demand in their internal world translates into restriction. They don't feel more loved, they feel more cornered. At the same time, your intention is completely different. You're not trying to trap them. You're trying to understand, to restore what felt good in the beginning. But the emotional gap between intention and perception is where everything starts to break down. You move forward to build connection while they step back to regain emotional space. This creates a loop where the more you pursue, the more they withdraw, and the more they withdraw, the more urgent your pursuit becomes. What makes this even more painful is that avoidants rarely explain this clearly. They don't always say, "I feel overwhelmed," or "I need space to regulate my emotions." Instead, they often go quiet, delay responses, become inconsistent, or emotionally flatten their communication. To you, it feels like rejection. To them, it feels like survival mode kicking in. And this is where the real misunderstanding happens. Because when someone you care about starts pulling away, your natural response is to close the distance. You try harder, love louder, and give more attention. But in this dynamic, effort is not interpreted as safety, yet is interpreted as intensity. And intensity for someone who is emotionally overwhelmed feels like something they need to escape from. This is also why avoidants often return. When things become calm again. When the emotional pressure disappears, their nervous system settles. They begin to think clearly again. They start to miss the connection not as a threat, but as something they can approach without losing themselves. But during the chase phase, everything feels amplified and unsustainable for them internally, even if nothing externally is wrong. The key truth hidden in all of this is that avoidants are not always running from you specifically. In many cases, they are running from the internal emotional experience that closeness triggers in them. And when that experience becomes too intense, they disconnect as a way to regulate themselves, not necessarily to punish you or end the bond. The moment you stop chasing is far more powerful than most people realize, because it doesn't just change what you do externally, it changes the entire emotional climate of the connection. Up until that point, the dynamic is predictable. One person pursues, the other retreats. Your attention, your effort, your emotional investment, all of it has been moving toward them. Even your frustration is still a form of engagement. So in their internal world, they become used to a certain rhythm. You reach, they pull back, and life continues in that loop. But when you stop, the rhythm breaks. At first, they may not react. In fact, one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant behavior is that silence does not immediately trigger panic in them the way it might in someone more anxious. Instead, they often experience relief. Not because they are happy you're gone, but because the emotional pressure they were unconsciously feeling has temporarily disappeared. The space returns. The intensity drops. Their nervous system can breathe again. This is the phase where they assume things are back under control. But something subtle starts to happen after that. Because the energy they were used to receiving from you, the texts, the checking in, the emotional presence, the consistent reaching suddenly disappears. And the absence of something familiar always creates curiosity, even in someone who values distance. The human brain is wired to notice patterns, and when a predictable pattern breaks, attention naturally shifts toward it. This is where your silence begins to speak louder than your words ever did. When you were chasing, your presence was loud, emotional, continuous. They could predict it. They could step back from it. They could manage it. But when you stop, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability creates mental space. That space is where thoughts begin to form without emotional pressure attached to them. They start to notice gaps, a message that didn't come, a reaction that didn't happen, a version of you that is no longer constantly available. And because avoidants are not emotionally flooded in this moment anymore, they don't interpret it through urgency, they interpret it through curiosity. Why did they stop? What changed? Did they lose interest? But underneath those surface level thoughts, something deeper begins to activate. A quiet awareness that the emotional access they once had is no longer guaranteed. And this is important because avoidants are often more sensitive to loss of autonomy than they are to emotional intensity. When they feel you pulling away completely, it no longer feels like pressure, it starts to feel like distance they did not choose. And that distinction matters. When you were chasing, they felt they could always step back and you would still be there. There was no real consequence to your pursuit maintained the connection. But when you stop, you remove that safety net. You are no longer compensating for their distance. You are no longer filling the gap. and suddenly their behavior has a reflection point. For the first time, their actions create actual space instead of just temporary relief. That's when the emotional landscape shifts. Not because they suddenly realize everything instantly, but because the connection is no longer one-sidedly sustained. Your absence becomes a presence of its own. It starts to sit in their awareness quietly, in moments they didn't expect it, when they're alone, when they're distracted, when they're not actively engaging with anything else. And in those small gaps of attention, something very human begins to happen: recalibration. They start to reassess not just your behavior, but the emotional significance of your presence. Not because you are trying to be noticed, but because you are no longer trying at all. That absence creates contrast, and contrast creates awareness. The one thing avoidants secretly crave is not what most people assume when they try to win them back. It's not constant attention, not emodio, not intensity, and not someone who keeps proving their love over and over again. In fact, those things usually create the opposite effect inside them. What they truly respond to is something much quieter, much more grounded, and far more emotionally rare. A sense of connection that does not come with pressure attached to it. At their core, avoidant individuals are managing an internal conflict between wanting closeness and fearing what closeness demands from them. They are not indifferent to connection. They are often deeply affected by it. But what they struggle with is the feeling that emotional closeness can quickly turn into expectation, dependency, or loss of personal space. So when someone comes toward them with intensity, even if it's love-driven, their system doesn't always register it as safety. It registers it as demand. This is why what they secretly crave is emotional safety without emotional captivity. They want to feel that they can be close to someone without immediately being required to respond, perform, explain, or emotionally regulate the other person. They are drawn to moments where connection exists but does not feel heavy, where presence is offered, not imposed. 2D, where love is felt but not forced. When you stop chasing, something subtle begins to shift in how they perceive you. You are no longer chasing closeness in a way that makes them feel cornered. Instead, you start to represent something different in their emotional landscape. Someone who is emotionally available but not emotionally dependent. And that distinction is powerful for an avoidant nervous system. Because dependency feels like pressure, but stability feels like safety. What they secretly crave is a version of love that does not collapse when they pull away slightly. Most of their past experiences with emotionally intense partners likely reinforce the idea that closeness equals obligation. If they don't respond quickly, it becomes a problem. If they need space, it becomes conflict. If they are not emotionally present, they are made to feel wrong for it. Over time, this creates internal resistance to emotional closeness itself. So when they encounter someone who no longer chases them, who no longer overextends themselves, and who no longer reacts with emotional panic to distance, something unexpected happens. The emotional pressure they are used to disappears. And in its place, something unfamiliar appears. Calm presence. That calm presence is what they secretly find disarming, because it does not demand immediate emotional reciprocity. It does not punish distance. It does not create urgency. Instead, it allows space for connection to exist without forcing it to constantly prove itself. And for an avoidant mind, that is rare enough to become noticeable. They may not consciously label it in the moment, but internally they begin to register that this connection feels different. Not because it is louder, but because it is quieter. Not because it is chasing them, but because it is simply their steady, unpressured, and self-contained. This is also where respect begins to form, even if it is not immediately expressed. Avoidants tend to respect emotional strength more than emotional pursuit. When they see that you are not collapsing into anxiety when they pull back, they begin to associate your presence with stability rather than emotional demand. And stability is something they can approach without feeling overwhelmed. What they secretly want is not distance forever, but distance that does not come with emotional consequences. They want to know that close, Ennis will not trap them, and space will not punish them. They want to feel that a connection can breathe without breaking. And when they sense even a glimpse of that possibility in you, the emotional dynamic changes not because you are trying harder, but because you are finally no longer trying to force what cannot be forced. Words can either feel like a soft place to land or like a trap closing in, especially for someone with an avoidant tendency. The difference is not just in what is said, but in the emotional energy behind it. When someone is avoidant, their nervous system is highly sensitive to anything that feels like pressure, expectation, or emotional demand. So even well-intended communication can sometimes be experienced as overwhelming if it carries urgency or neediness within it. What makes a person feel safe to an avoidant is not perfection in communication, but emotional regulation. When they sense that the other person is steady, not reactive, not emotionally escalating, something inside them begins to soften. Because deep down, avoidants are not looking for chaos or emotional intensity. They are looking for connection that does not threaten their sense of control over they themselves. When you speak from a place of calm confidence, you are communicating something far more powerful than the actual words. You are communicating emotional independence. You are showing that your feelings exist, but they are not spilling over into desperation. That your care is real, but it is not demanding an immediate response or validation. This distinction is crucial because it directly contrasts with what they are used to experiencing in emotionally charged dynamics. Many avoidants are accustomed to relationships where emotional conversations quickly escalate into pressure. If they withdraw, they are questioned. If they take space, they are pursued. If they don't respond, it turns into conflict. Over time, this creates a learned association where emotional expression feels risky, because it leads to obligation or emotional confrontation. So when they encounter words that are calm, grounded, and free of emotional pressure, it interrupts that pattern. It does not activate their defense system in the same way. Instead of preparing to retreat, their mind stays open long enough to actually process what is being said. This is where calm confidence becomes powerful. It is number 2, T about acting detached or pretending not to care. It is about expressing yourself without emotional escalation. It is the ability to say something meaningful without attaching fear to it. For example, instead of trying to convince someone to stay, the energy shifts into stating your truth and allowing space for them to respond freely. To an avoidant, this feels different because it does not corner them. It does not push them into an emotional reaction they are not ready for. It does not demand immediate emotional alignment. Instead, it creates space where they can think without pressure, feel without being controlled, and respond without feeling trapped. And in that space, something subtle happens. Their resistance lowers. Not because they suddenly become emotionally open, but because their internal alarm system is not being triggered. Calm confidence communicates safety because it does not escalate when distance appears. It does not collapse when silence happens. It does not turn emotional discomfort into emotional pressure. This is deeply important because avoidants often associate emotional intensity with loss of freedom. But calm confidence reverses that association. It shows those that connection does not automatically equal confinement. That someone can care deeply without becoming emotionally reactive. That love does not always have to come with urgency attached to it. When your words carry this kind of energy, they begin to land differently. Even simple statements start to feel meaningful because they are not wrapped in emotional chaos. There is clarity in them. There is steadiness in them. And steadiness is something avoidants rarely experience in emotionally charged situations. This is why calm confidence is not just communication, it is emotional leadership. It sets the tone of interaction. It tells the other person without force or persuasion that emotional safety exists here. Not because everything is perfect, but because nothing is being emotionally demanded in a way that overwhelms the system. And for someone who is used to preparing for emotional pressure, that kind of interaction stands out. Not because it is loud, but because it is peaceful enough to stay in. Silence has a strange reputation in relationships. For many people, it feels like punishment, rejection, or loss. When someone pulls away, the natural instinct is to fill the gap immediately. Dietly send another message, clarify feelings, ask what went wrong, or try to restore the connection through effort. But in dynamics involving avoidant individuals, silence functions very differently. It is not empty space. It is information. And more importantly, it is a mirror. When you are actively chasing, your presence becomes predictable. Even if the avoidant pulls away, there is an underlying assumption that you will return to close the gap. That consistency, while emotionally reassuring for you, can unconsciously reduce urgency for them. Because no matter how far they step back, the emotional thread remains unbroken. Your pursuit keeps the connection alive even in their absence. But when you stop chasing, something significant happens in the emotional structure between both people. The thread is no longer being continuously maintained by one side. There is no longer constant reinforcement of access, attention, or emotional availability. And this is where silence begins to take on weight. For an avoidant, silence does not immediately translate into emotional panic. In many cases, it first translates into relief. The emotional pressure they associate with pursuit is gone. Air are no incoming expectations, no emotional demands, no need to respond or regulate someone else's feelings. The nervous system relaxes because the perceived obligation temporarily disappears. This is why the initial phase of silence often feels calm rather than chaotic. However, that calm does not remain static. Once the pressure is gone, attention begins to shift. And human attention is naturally drawn toward change, absence, and disruption of patterns. When something that was previously present is no longer there, the brain begins to register the contrast, not as emotional urgency, but as curiosity. This is where silence becomes powerful, because silence does not argue, explain, or demand. It simply exists. And in its existence, it creates space for reflection without interference. The avoidant is no longer reacting to your emotional energy. Instead, they are left alone with their own perception of the connection, without external pressure shaping it in real time. In that space, thoughts begin to surface that were previously overshadowed by interaction. Questions that were unnecessary while you are actively pursuing now become more visible. Not because something dramatic has happened, but because the absence of your presence removes emotional noise from the equation. Why did things go quiet? Did they move on? Why does this feel different now? These are not always intense emotional questions at first. Often, they start as quiet observations, but over time they gain depth as the reality of absence settles in. What once felt like a stable dynamic now has a missing piece. Silence also introduces something avoidants are highly sensitive to, even if they don't consciously label it. Loss of control over emotional pacing. When you were chasing, they can regulate the distance. They could step back and still feel the connection persist. But when you stop, they are no longer the sole regulator of closeness and distance. The dynamic becomes less predictable, and unpredictability naturally increases cognitive focus. What makes silence especially impactful is that it does not push them. It does not force emotional engagement. It does not create pressure that would trigger withdrawal. Instead, it allows the emotional system to process without threat. That absence of pressure is what makes the reflection deeper rather than defensive. And as time continues with chasing, the emotional memory of the connection begins to resurface differently. Not as something actively demanding attention, but as something that is no longer immediately accessible. This shift changes the emotional meaning of your presence. You are no longer just available in the background. You are now someone who has stepped out of the cycle. That shift is what gives silence its power. Not because silence is loud, but because it removes everything else that was filling the space. And in that emptiness, awareness begins to grow naturally, without force, without pursuit, and without interference. Rebuilding your power after a dynamic like this is not about becoming colder, harder, or emotionally detached. It is about returning to a version of yourself that is no longer emotionally dependent on someone else's inconsistency to define your worth. When you've been in a cycle of chasing someone who keeps pulling away, your emotional energy gradually starts orbiting around their responses. A reply feels like relief. Silence feels like confusion. Distance feels like rejection. Without realizing it, your internal stability begins to depend on external behavior you cannot control. Pull out. Breaking that pattern is where real strength begins. The first shift is internal. You stop interpreting distance as a reflection of your value. An avoidant pulling away is no longer a signal that you are not enough. It becomes what it actually is, a reflection of their emotional wiring, their comfort patterns, and their capacity for closeness at that moment. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because when their behavior stops defining your emotional state, you regain control over your own inner world. From that point, you are no longer negotiating your worth through pursuit. You are no longer trying to earn consistency by being more available, more understanding, or more patient than you already have been. Instead, you begin to observe without emotional collapse. You start seeing patterns instead of personalizing pain. Rebuilding your power also means redirecting your attention back to your own life with intention. Not as a distraction, but as a reclamation. The energy that was once consumed by overthinking messages, analyzing tone, or waiting for responses becomes available again. And that energy, when redirected into growth, creativity, discipline, or purpose, begins to restore identity. Because chasing doesn't just drain emotion, it slowly weakens identity. You start to become someone who reacts instead of someone who creates. Someone who waits instead of someone who builds. Reclaiming your power reverses that direction. You stop living in response to someone else's emotional availability and start living according to your own direction again. Another key part of rebuilding is emotional discipline. This does not mean suppressing feelings or pretending you are unaffected. It means learning to feel without immediately acting on emotional impulses. When you feel the urge to chase, explain, or seek reassurance, you pause long enough to recognize the pattern instead of feeding it instantly. That pause is where your power returns because it interrupts the automatic cycle that kept you emotionally stuck. Over time, this creates a new internal standard. You begin to notice that peace feels better than unpredictability. Stability starts to feel more attractive than emotional highs and lows. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. and start valuing emotional clarity. This is a profound shift because it changes what you are willing to tolerate in connection. CDON. And when your tolerance changes, your behavior naturally changes too. You become more selective with your emotional investment. You stop overextending yourself to maintain access to people who offer inconsistency in return. You begin to recognize that love without stability is not love you need to chase it, is something you need to evaluate more carefully. This is where self-respect becomes visible in your actions, not in words, not in declarations, but in what you no longer participate in. You stop forcing conversations that require you to abandon your dignity. You stop trying to fix emotional distance that is not yours to repair alone. You stop shrinking yourself to maintain connection. And paradoxically, this is often the point where you become most emotionally magnetic again, not because you are trying to be, but because you are no longer emotionally scattered. Your presence becomes grounded. Your energy becomes steady. Your choices become intentional. And your emotional world is no longer dictated by someone else's inconsistency. Rebuilding your power is not about getting someone to realize your worth. It is about reaching a state where their realization is no longer required. I'd be for you to feel whole. What ties everything together in this entire journey is a very uncomfortable truth that most people only learn after repeated emotional exhaustion. Chasing someone who is emotionally inconsistent does not create love. It creates imbalance. The more you try to secure closeness through effort, explanation, or emotional pursuit, the more you unknowingly place your value in their hands. And when your emotional stability depends on someone who is not stable in their availability, you slowly lose connection with yourself. This is why the turning point is never about changing the Met, is about stopping the cycle that disconnects you from your own inner peace. When you finally stop chasing, it is not just a behavioral shift, it is an identity shift. You move from being someone who reacts to someone who observes, from someone who overinvests emotionally to someone who begins to evaluate emotional energy more carefully. In that space, silence is no longer something to fear. It becomes something that reveals truth. The silence removes the illusion that effort alone can hold a connection together. It shows you what remains when pressure is gone, and that clarity is often painful, but necessary for growth. At the same time, this process exposes something deeper about avoidant dynamics. It shows that distance is not always rejection, and pursuit is not always love. Often, both are coping strategies from two different emotional systems trying to protect themselves in opposite ways. One pulls away to feel safe, while the other moves closer to feel secure. But without balance, this creates emotional friction instead of emotional harmony. And when you stop chasing, you interrupt that pattern. You step out of the emotional push and pull and return to your own center. As your emotional dependence decreases, something powerful begins to happen internally. You stop interpreting inconsistency as a reflection of your worth. You stop measuring your value through someone else's availability. And you begin to understand that real emotional strength is not about forcing connection, but about maintaining your dignity even in uncertainty. This is where self-respect becomes your foundation again. Not as an idea, but as a lived experience reflected in your choices, your silence, and your boundaries. And finally, what remains after all of this is clarity. Please. Ready about what you will no longer chase, clarity about what you actually need, and clarity about the kind of emotional energy you are willing to accept in your life. Whether someone comes back or not is no longer the center of your world. The center becomes your growth, your peace, and your emotional stability. And from that place, you are no longer waiting to be chosen. You are choosing yourself first, without hesitation, without fear, and without compromise. Thank you for being here and investing your time in this message. I truly hope it brought you insight, strength, and a new perspective on your own emotional journey. Take care of your heart.